How to know if you should plant the plant or the seed. It's a big decision and super important. And we're going to talk about it in this video. Hey there, I'm Nicole Burke, and today we're going to talk about how to plant your plants when you're planting in the garden. Should you plant a plant or should you plant a seed? That is a super important decision, and there's a few key factors that I think about every time I'm about to plant in my garden. So let's dive into it. The first thing that you want to take into consideration when you're deciding, should I plant a plant or should I plant a seed, is timing. So each different plant has built into its genetics a certain amount of time that it needs to be in the garden to reach maturity. And so when you're starting to plant a plant into your garden, you want to take that into account. So for instance, I have this tomato here, and in general, a tomato plant will start to fruit at about 50 to 60 days after planting a plant in the garden. So it's not going to produce fruit 60 days after the seed was planted. It produces fruit 60 days after the plant was planted. Well, here in the Chicago area, I also know that tomatoes don't like frost, and it also likes warmer weather. So not just no frost, but also weather that's around the high 70s into the 80s. And I know my weather pretty well to know that I only have about 3 months of the whole year when the weather is like that. So given those two factors, knowing that this plant isn't even going to start to fruit until the plant has been in the ground for at least 60 days, and I only have about 90 days when the weather works well for a tomato plant in Chicago, I'm going to go with plant when it comes to planting a tomato. Now, I could start this seed indoors way back in, say, February or March here in the Chicago area, grow it for about 45 or 60 days indoors, and then move that plant out to the garden after there's a chance of frost. But knowing the timing, knowing how much time it's going to take for this plant to be ready to harvest, given that alongside what the weather will be during that time frame, that's a huge decider of whether you're going to plant a plant or plant the seed. Another example would be my kale. So in my garden right now, I actually don't have tomatoes planted right now because it's too cool. Well, it's right on the border of not being too cool, but we're almost there. I have a variety of things planted in the cool season here in my garden. So one is kale. Now I know that kale takes about, say, 45 days to be ready to harvest from seed. So after a seed is planted, about 45 days later, I can start to harvest. But I know that kale prefers cooler weather. And cooler weather where it's not freezing cold starts around March here. So I knew that if I put a plant into this garden, it would be in its prime weather earlier and faster and ready to harvest if I put a plant out here rather than a seed. Versus in March, if I had come out and taken one of these kale seeds and planted just the seed, right at this moment, so this is about 45 days from planting when I could have planted the kale directly as a seed, I would just barely be starting to get little baby kale leaves. But I've been harvesting from these plants since April, and you can see all this new growth, all these huge kale leaves, and you can see all the places I've already harvested from. So by starting this as a plant in this garden versus putting a seed in here, I've gotten to harvest way earlier, and I get to enjoy this plant in its optimal time frame. So that's the first thing to consider when you're deciding between seeds or plants, is knowing the timing. How long does it take your plant from the seed or from the plant to be ready to harvest? And then how does that pair up with the weather and the time frame that you've got coming in your own particular place where you're living and gardening? That's number one. The second thing to consider is size. As a general rule, even if I ignore the timing altogether, usually if it's a large size plant, 9 times, probably 7 times out of 10, I'm going to put a plant in the garden. Let me show you what I mean. So here in this garden, we have kale plants, which will grow really large. We have cabbages, which will also grow really large. And then again, we have kale plants. Now for me, I call all these large plants, meaning they're gonna take up at least 1 square foot in the garden. Then I also have a lot of smaller plants. So I have spinach, I have chives, I have some lettuces, I have radishes. And then I also have up here, I have peas. Now peas are an exception, and I'll get to them in a second because they do grow a little bit larger. But when I look at this whole bed, the plants that I generally want to put in as a plant are the ones that are going to be larger. Because with plants, it's very similar to the situation with animals, right? A big animal takes a long time to grow, and a big plant also takes a long time to grow. So something like radishes or lettuces or peas, but especially radishes and lettuces, because of their smaller nature, they're going to be able to be planted by seed, grow up to their full maturity, and be ready to harvest in a much quicker time than these larger plants. So that's the second thing to consider, is the size of the plant at its full maturity. If in general, when you think about that plant, that it's going to be a square foot or larger at its full mature growth, then 7 out of 10 times, that's going to be a plant that goes into the garden rather than a seed. Now, there are a couple exceptions to those two rules, and that is what brings me to point number 3, and that's just a specific frailty, I would say, of the particular plant. There are some plants, some types of plants that do not like to be moved. Well, I would say plants in general don't like to be moved, right? Like, let's face it, plants are meant to be planted. They're not like animals. They're not used to moving around to a lot of different places. So any kind of plants, when you can have the seed directly sown in the garden that it's going to grow in, you're generally almost always going to have a healthier plant because that seed never had to deal with the stress of the move. And some plants, even if they grow really big and large, even if they have a really long planting, like a long time to get to maturity, like a tomato, some plants just don't want to be moved once they've been planted by seed. Some of those are in the legume family, so things like peas and pole beans. So these plants technically are going to go 60 to 75 days before you harvest from them. So they're large plants. I mean, they take a long time. In general, they're going to grow really big. Like these peas are going to go up the trellis and around them. But what I've generally found is that peas and beans can be kind of sensitive to moving. So beans in the summer and peas in the winter. Now, I do know some gardeners who transplant peas all the time and have tons of success. I've just found in general that peas are more sensitive to moving than something like a kale plant or a cabbage plant or a tomato. The other plant families that are sensitive to being moved are the lettuce plant family, which that actually applies to my other rule, which is they're small and they don't take a lot of time to grow. So that's why you would want to put seeds directly into the garden for lettuces. But big plant families that would kind of break the rules would be the cucurbit family. So squash, zucchini, cucumbers. Those take a long time. They need optimal weather to grow when it's warmer. That isn't always going to be a long period of time, but the seeds in general are very sensitive to being moved. So if I'm making a choice, I'm generally going to put cucumber seeds, squash, zucchini. I'm going to direct seed those into my garden rather than planting them directly like I will with my tomatoes. Tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, all the plants in the nightshade family, in general, I've found they don't mind being moved at all. So that is kind of the breakdown, the 3 steps you want to go through when you're trying to decide, do I plant a plant or do I plant a seed? First, figure out how long this plant needs to grow from the plant or the seed, how long it's going to take to reach maturity and in what weather. Then compare that with your own climate and the days that are coming ahead of you, what the temperatures are going to be, and how many days you have coming that will support this particular plant's growth. If there's not a lot of days coming for optimal growth, you need to plant a plant so you can hurry up and get to the fruit. Then the next criteria is to determine, is it a large plant? If the plant is going to grow to more than a square foot, in general you want to transplant plants directly into the garden and not plant seeds. Plants like cabbages and kales, these are going to be planted directly into the garden, whereas the plants that are smaller, that are more like one every, you could do 4 to 6 per square foot, those can be planted directly by seed. And then the third criteria is just if you know the particular plant family or the particular plant just does not like being moved. Plants in the cucurbit family and plants in the legume family both qualify for this, where in general, they would prefer that you do not move them around. So that, my friends, is the criteria I use to decide whether I'm going to plant a plant or plant a seed. Do you have something that helps you decide which one you're going to choose? I would love to hear about it in the comments so I can learn from you too. If you want to know more about choosing your plants and choosing how you're going to set up your layout in your kitchen garden, I talk all about this method and so much more in my book, Kitchen Garden Revival. And there's a link to it right below this video. So thanks so much for watching. Please subscribe and hang out with us all season long. I will see you next time. Bye.